A silent, star-dusted sky over the Bering Sea. It is not true silence. At Mach 3.2, sound is left far behind, but vibration remains. Deep metallic hum courses through the titanium spine of the aircraft. In the cockpit, encapsulated in a pressure suit, the pilot monitors a bank of analog gauges. Outside, the skin of the aircraft glows a dull cherry red, heated to 500 degrees Fahrenheit by friction alone. The horizon is a pronounced, curving blue line against the blackness of This is SR-71 Blackbird, cruising at 85,000 feet. A sovereign entity in a realm no other aircraft can reach. Suddenly, a jolt. Not violent, but wrong. A shudder in the smooth, continuous Pratt & Whitney J58 engines. A warning light flickers on the pilot's panel. Then another. The rhythm fractures into a stutter. In seconds, the controlled fury of hypersonic flight unravels. A cascade of system failures. The nose of the Blackbird, responding to a sudden loss of thrust, begins a slow, inevitable yaw to the right. From a god's vantage point, the pilot is now a prisoner in a falling comet. The cockpit voice recorder later captures only the sterile, urgent calls of procedure, but behind the visor, his world has collapsed into a single imperative: survive. He reaches for the ejection ring between his knees. A final glance at the disintegrating instrument panel. He pulls. The explosion of the ejection seat is a violent mercy. One moment a heated cocoon, the next a blinding cartridge flash, a crushing 20G kick, and then absolute, terrifying silence. He is tumbling in thin, 60-degree air, the dark mass of his burning aircraft spiraling away below him, trailing a funeral pyre of sparks against the vast frozen darkness of eastern Siberia. The chase for the Soviet interceptors, already screaming to altitude, has just begun. But their prize is no longer a machine, it is a man. The game was intelligence. In the decades following World War II, the Iron Curtain descended not just across Europe, but across the flow of information. For the United States and its NATO allies, the Soviet Union had become a vast sealed fortress. Its military deployments, industrial complexes, and nuclear developments were hidden behind a veil of state secrecy and immense geographic scale. Traditional espionage on the ground was high risk and limited in scope. The U.S. needed to see everything. This imperative birthed a new era of technological espionage: overhead reconnaissance. It began with modified bombers like the RB-47, flying perilously close to Soviet borders to sniff electronic signals. Then came the high-flying U-2, a glider-like aircraft designed by Kelly Johnson's Lockheed Skunk Works. On July 4, 1956, the U-2 began its deep penetration mission over the USSR. For 4 years, it flew with impunity at 70,000 feet, capturing photographs of breathtaking clarity, mapping Soviet military infrastructure with a detail that revolutionized intelligence estimates. The U-2's success, however, sowed the seeds of its own vulnerability. Soviet radar tracked it from the beginning. They simply lacked an interceptor or missile that could reach it. That race was now on. The U-2's reign ended spectacularly on May 1, 1960, when a Soviet S-75 Venus surface-to-air missile Francis Gary Powers aircraft near Sverdlovsk. The political fallout was immense, shattering a planned Paris summit and proving that altitude alone was no longer a guaranteed sanctuary. The fortress had developed a longer spear. Even before Powers' parachute settled onto Russian soil, the successor was already on the drawing boards. The requirement was audacious: an aircraft that could not just fly high, but fly fast, so fast that no missile could catch it, and no interceptor could get near it. The answer was not evolution, but a quantum leap in aerospace engineering. Lockheed's A-12 Oxcart and its derivative, the USAF's SR-71 Blackbird, were the physical manifestations of this doctrine. Speed would be the ultimate cloak. The SR-71 was built not of aluminum, but of titanium, a metal sourced through clandestine channels from the USSR itself. Its Pratt & Whitney J58 engines were marvels of thermodynamics, functioning as hybrid turbojet ramjets. At Mach 3.2, over 85% of its thrust came from the ramjet effect of its meticulously designed inlets. Its radar cross-section was reduced, not through geometry as understood today, but through sheer velocity and a chassis designed to deflect radar waves. It carried the most advanced synthetic aperture radar and optical cameras of its era, capable of imaging a parking lot from 15 miles up with startling detail. Its operational protocol was as unique as its design. It flew only from select bases: Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan, for Asian missions, REF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom for European sorties, and from a secretive, dedicated detachment at Beale Air Force Base in California. Each mission was a ballet of precision. Aerial refueling would occur immediately after takeoff, the Blackbird guzzling its specialized JPC-7, so inert you could drop a match into it from a KCC-135Q tanker. Then it would accelerate, climbing to its operational ceiling, a dark arrowhead-shaped silhouette against the stratosphere. Its targets were the crown jewels of Soviet secrecy: the naval yards at Murmansk and Vladivostok, the missile test ranges at Kapustin Yar and the Kamchatka Peninsula, the anti-ballistic missile systems around Moscow, and the vast stretches of the Trans-Siberian Railway, watching for military deployments. One of its most critical and perilous routes was the Baltic Express, a sprint along the Soviet western border, and the Habu runs from Kadena, which would often probe the maritime approaches to Siberia and the Soviet Far East. It was on one such northern profile, where the Bering Sea meets the Soviet coastline, that the margin for error vanished to zero. The Soviet response to the American reconnaissance challenge was not merely military, but philosophical. It was rooted in a deep-seated historical paranoia of invasion, now magnified by Cold War ideology. The entire nation was a fortress, and its airspace was a sanctum. To violate it was an act of war. This mindset institutionalized the most extensive, integrated air defense network ever conceived: the Protivo-Vazdušnaya Obrona Strany, PVO Strany, the anti-air defense of the nation. The PVO Strany was a separate military branch, a testament to its importance. It was a tripartite system of colossal scale. A vast web of early warning radars stretching from the Kola Peninsula to Kamchatka, thousands of surface-to-air missile (SAM) sites ringing every city, industrial complex, and military base, and perhaps most critically, a dedicated force of high-performance interceptor aircraft and the elite pilots who flew them. Their mandate was absolute. No unauthorized aircraft was to penetrate Soviet airspace. If it did, it was to be destroyed. The downing of Powers U-2 was not an anomaly. It was doctrine successfully executed. The arrival of the A-12 SR-71 presented the PVO with an existential crisis. Their radars could detect the Blackbird. Its immense speed and heat signature made it a blazing target on scopes, but tracking it consistently was a problem, and engaging it seemed futile. At 80,000 feet and Mach 3, it operated in a flight envelope Soviet technology could not touch. The standard PVO interceptor of the early 1960s, the MiG-19, was utterly outclassed. The supersonic MiG-21 Fishbed could barely reach the Blackbird's altitude in a zoom climb, and only for a fleeting moment, with no hope of a stable firing solution. The Soviet military-industrial complex responded with a series of specialized, high-altitude interceptors. The Yakovlev Yak-28P Firebar, a twin-engine fighter, was one of the first attempts, but it lacked the sustained high-altitude performance. The answer came in the form of the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau's creations. The MiG-25 Foxbat, unveiled to the world in 1967, was built for one purpose: to intercept the Blackbird. Constructed of steel to withstand the heat of sustained Mach 2.8+ flight, powered by enormous Tumansky R-15 turbojets, and armed with 4 massive R-40 air-to-air missiles, the Foxbat was a brute-force solution. It could climb to over 75,000 feet and, in a sprint, approach Mach 3. However, it was a short-range, ground-controlled interceptor. Its radar, the powerful RP-5 Smerch, was designed to burn through electronic jamming and lock onto a large, fast target from behind. Its pilots were the best of the PVO, trained relentlessly for a single high-speed, high-altitude intercept profile. But the MiG-25 had a critical weakness. At its maximum speed, its engines would be damaged, often requiring complete replacement. Its missiles, the radar-guided R-40R and infrared-seeking R-40T, had limited kinematic reach against a target pulling away at Mach 3.2. The interception profile was a desperate geometry problem. The ground controllers would have to vector the Foxbat to a precise point in the sky, far ahead of the Blackbird's projected flight path, hoping for a fleeting head-on or stern shot. It was like trying to hit a bullet with a slightly slower bullet, guided by instructions from the ground. Beyond the Interceptors lay the SAM threat. The S-75 that downed the U-2 was joined by the more advanced S-125 Neva and the long-range, high-altitude S-200 Angara system. The S-200, in particular, with its massive V-880 missile, had the range and altitude to theoretically threaten the SR-71. But against a Mach 3 target, the engagement sequence was agonizingly slow. By the time a radar lock was established, missiles launched, and climbed to altitude, the Blackbird would already be streaking out of the engagement zone. The Soviet strategy evolved into a layered, desperate attempt at saturation. SAM sites would attempt to force the SR-71 to deviate or be caught in a lucky shot, while MiG-25s would scramble from forward bases like those on the Chukotka Peninsula or Sakhalin Island, hoping to get into position for a snapshot. This was the lethal chessboard over which every Habu mission was flown. A sovereign, paranoid airspace guarded by the most dense concentration of air defense weaponry in history, commanded by men under orders to destroy the intruder at any cost. The Blackbird's safety lay in its performance envelope, a slender, mathematical margin of superiority. As long as the engines thundered and the airframe held, the fortress walls were scalable. But physics is unforgiving. Machinery fails. And on the rare occasion when that titanium marvel faltered, the pilot didn't just face a mechanical emergency. He would fall directly into the heart of the fortress, becoming the ultimate prize in a decade-long high-altitude duel. The SR-71 Blackbird was not merely an aircraft, it was a statement of thermodynamic and aerodynamic defiance. Every line, every material, every system was engineered to a single brutal environmental niche, the thin, searing hot air of the stratosphere at triple the speed of sound. Its design began with a fundamental truth. At Mach 3.2, over 90% of the forward velocity is due to the sheer force of air being rammed into its engines. The entire airframe was, in effect, a carefully shaped duct for this hypersonic wind. Its skin, corrugated like cardboard, was made of a titanium alloy known as B120. This corrugation allowed it to expand and contract without stressing itself to failure, as the aircraft's skin would heat to over 500 degrees Fahrenheit in cruise, causing it to grow several inches in length. The iconic black paint, infused with microscopic iron ferrite particles, served a dual purpose. It radiated internal heat and lowered the radar correction slightly, but its primary function was to manage the extreme thermal differential across the airframe. Even the fuel, JP-7, was a specialized marvel. With a high flash point, it was stable enough to be used as a hydraulic fluid and coolant, running through heat exchangers to cool the cockpit, avionics, and critical engine oil before being burned. The heart of the Blackbird's performance were its Pratt & Whitney J58 engines, a hybrid unlike any before or since. Up to about Mach 2.4, they functioned as conventional afterburning turbojets. Beyond that, 6 large bypass tubes opened, ducting air directly from the 4th compressor stage into the afterburner. At Mach 3.2, the turbojet core became almost a secondary system. The engine transformed into a ramjet, with the carefully shock-controlled spike in the center of each inlet doing the crucial work of slowing the supersonic airflow to a manageable subsonic speed for combustion. A misalignment of that spike by mere inches could cause an unstart. a violent shockwave that would blast through the inlet, stalling the engine and slamming the aircraft sideways. It was a system of exquisite, delicate balance operating in an environment of apocalyptic force. For the pilot, this machine was both cathedral and cage. The cockpit, forward of the immense chines that gave the Blackbird its distinctive shape, was a pressurized sanctuary wrapped in a furnace. He wore a full pressure suit, a forerunner of the astronaut's space suit, connected to a dedicated oxygen and cooling system. Outside his small quartz windows, the sky was not blue but the deep purple-black of the upper atmosphere, the Earth a distant, curved panorama. His mission was one of profound isolation and concentration, monitoring a bank of 1960s-era analog gauges, managing a temperamental fuel system that deliberately leaked on the ground until thermal expansion sealed its tanks, and communicating with his reconnaissance systems officer in the rear seat. Together, they were not just airmen. They were operators of a national technical means, collecting secrets from the edge of space, forever dancing along the line where a minor technical failure meant not just a loss of the aircraft, but a diplomatic catastrophe of the highest order. On the other side of the radar scope, in the chilled, dimly lit ready rooms of bases like Sokol on Sakhalin Island or Anadyr in Chukotka, sat a different breed of aviator. They were not strategic reconnaissance specialists, but duelists. Pilots of the PVO Strany were the elite guardians of the Soviet air frontier, selected for discipline, political reliability, and technical skill. Their enemy was not a nation, but a blip, a high-speed, high-altitude violation of the sacred border. And their holy grail was the Amerikansky Razvedchik, the SR-71. Flying aircraft like the MiG-25 Foxbat, these men were components in a vast, ground-controlled interception machine. A typical scramble was not an exercise of individual pilot initiative, but of rigid protocol. The alarm would sound. Pilots would sprint to their aircraft, which were often kept fueled, armed, and ready on constant alert. Once airborne, they would be handed over to a ground control intercept (GCI) officer who monitored the air picture from radar feeds in a buried bunker. The GCI officer's voice, calm and authoritative, would talk the pilot in position. Interceptor 175, climb to 18,000 meters, heading 085, accelerate to maximum. The pilot was an extension of the ground, his aircraft a missile with a man in it, flying a pre-calculated collision course. The MiG-25 was a demanding beast. Built around two enormous Tumensky R-15 engines and a robust steel airframe, it was designed for a brutal high-speed dash. At speeds above Mach 2.8, its engines risked catastrophic damage from overheating, a limit strictly enforced. The cockpit was sparse, focused on the essential: the radar scope, the engine gauges, the missile arming panel. The radar, the RP-25 Smerch, could lock a target the size of the SR-71 from over 50 miles away in a tail chase, but against the Blackbird's superior speed, a tail chase was impossible. The only viable profile was a head-on or sidelong interception, a complex geometry problem solved on the ground and relayed to the man in the cockpit. For these Soviet pilots, an SR-71 track was the ultimate test. It was a source of immense frustration and obsessive focus. They would scramble, push their aircraft to the limits, clawing for altitude, only to watch the American intruder's radar return maintain its serene, untouchable progression across their scopes, always just out of reach. They knew the statistics, the altitude gap, the speed deficit. Yet, they trained for the moment when the Americans' technology might fail, a flameout, a decompression, a mistake. In that moment, the hunter could close in. Their weapons, the long-range R-40 missiles, were fearsome. The infrared-seeking RET had a seeker head cooled by liquid nitrogen, designed to ignore the cold of the high stratosphere and lock the intense thermal bloom of a jet engine. To hit a shot, however, they needed closure. They needed the SR-71 to slow down, to descend, to become vulnerable. They needed essence for a miracle of American engineering to fail, a hope that was not just tactical, but almost philosophical, pitting Soviet determination against American technical arrogance. Beneath the stratospheric duel lay a theater of operations that was itself a hostile force. Siberia. For a downed Blackbird crew, it was not merely enemy territory. It was a primordial, unforgiving expanse that posed a threat as lethal as any PVO interceptor. This was not the Europe of forests and fields, or the manageable deserts of the American Southwest. This was the taiga and the tundra, the vast coniferous forests and the treeless permafrost plains of the Russian Far East. The region into which a crippled SR-71 would most likely fall, the Chukotka Autonomous Okrug Kamchatka, or the Magadan Oblast, represented some of the most isolated and climatically extreme terrain on the planet. Winters were endless, with temperatures routinely plunging to 50 degrees Celsius, to 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and violent Arctic storms known as purga, blizzards, that could reduce visibility to zero and freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Summers were brief, but brought their own horrors: vast, sucking bogs of melted permafrost, clouds of aggressive mosquitoes and midges, and treacherous, swollen rivers. The human infrastructure was sparse. A few isolated mining towns, Soviet military outposts, and indigenous Chukchi and Evenki settlements were connected by rudimentary roads, often impassable, or by the skeletal network of the Soviet air service. For hundreds of miles in any direction, there might be nothing but rolling, wind-scoured tundra, dense, trackless forest, or jagged, volcanic mountain ranges. Survival here, even with preparation, was a monumental challenge. Without it, death would come from exposure, dehydration, or predator attacks within days, if not hours. This geography shaped the strategic calculus of both sides. For the Soviet search and recovery forces, it offered a nightmarish logistical puzzle. Even with a rough location from radar or visual sightings, deploying ground troops, helicopters, or tracking dogs across such terrain was slow, arduous, and often ineffective. A downed crew that survived the ejection had a chance to vanish into this immense landscape, buying precious time. For the United States, it defined the extreme parameters of the Combat Search and Rescue (CSAR) mission. Any recovery operation would have to penetrate not only the world's most sophisticated air defenses, but also navigate and extract personnel from one of the planet's most hostile environments, all while the clock tensed both Soviet pursuers and the Siberian cold. The wilderness was the great equalizer. It could hide a man or consume him. It could frustrate a regiment of searchers or guide them with a chance track in the snow. For the pilot swinging beneath his parachute canopy, watching the immensity of the landscape rise to meet him, the realization was immediate. His battle was no longer with missiles or MiGs. It was with the ground, the wind, and the cold. His training would now shift from managing systems to enacting the most primitive of imperatives: find water, find shelter, stay alive. Who was the man at the center of this technological marvel? The pilot of the SR-71 was not a typical fighter jock. He was part test pilot, part systems manager, part strategic intelligence officer. The selection process for the Blackbird program was perhaps the most rigorous in the U.S. Air Force. Candidates were drawn from the ranks of experienced, high-performing pilots, often from strategic bomber or reconnaissance backgrounds. They needed not just exceptional flying skills, but profound maturity, unflappable judgment, and the intellectual capacity to understand the global political ramifications of their mission. The psychological profile was specific. The ideal Habu pilot was calm, analytical, and introverted, capable of enduring hours of extreme sensory deprivation and immense responsibility without succumbing to boredom or panic. He had to possess what aviators call situational awareness on a geopolitical scale. A mistake at Mach 3 could propel him dozens of miles off course, directly into a SAM engagement zone or over sovereign territory, sparking an international incident. The pressure was constant, a low hum in the background of every mission. His world was one of intense physical sensation mediated by layers of technology. The pressure suit was his personal spacecraft, a bulky, restrictive garment that was his only link to life above 50,000 feet. The constant roar of the engines was felt more than heard, a deep vibration that became part of his body's rhythm. The visual reality outside his window, the curvature of the earth, the black sky, the sun shining at midday with the stars visible, was a vista afforded to only a handful of humans, a beauty that was always juxtaposed with the knowledge of his vulnerability. A sudden loss of cabin pressure at cruise altitude would cause his blood to boil in seconds without the suit. This training prepared him for the machine's failure, but in an abstract way. Simulators could replicate an unstart, an engine fire, a hydraulic failure. They could drill the emergency procedures, the communication codes, the attempt to steer the stricken jet toward international waters. But no simulation could truly capture the visceral, gut-wrenching moment when the symphony of controlled fury that was the Blackbird in cruise fell into discord, and then silence. No drill could fully replicate the emotional vertigo of transitioning from being the master of the stratosphere, invulnerable and supreme, to becoming a falling, fragile piece of debris in the sky of his nation's foremost adversary. In that moment, all the technology, all the planning, all the political stakes condensed into a single human consciousness. The years of training would either assert themselves as cold, automatic procedure or be washed away by a tide of primal fear. He was no longer a Habu driver. He was a man facing an almost certain trinity of fates: capture by the KGB, death in the wilderness, or, if the stars aligned, a near miraculous recovery. His next actions, in the 3 minutes between the failure and his parachute settling onto the snow, would write the ending. The mission profile was designated a training flight out of Kadena Air Base, Okinawa. In the lexicon of the Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, this meant it would follow an operational track, testing systems and procedures, but without the specific sensor payloads of a tasked intelligence collection sortie. The date was a classified day in the late 1960s. The aircraft, SR-71 tail number 972, was a veteran of many northern runs. Its crew, pilot Major James H., pseudonym used for historical anonymity, and Reconnaissance Systems Officer Captain Leslie C., were experienced Habu hands. Their planned route would take them north over the Pacific, skirting the eastern edge of Soviet airspace, a high-speed probe along the periphery to monitor radar reactions and communications traffic. A routine test of the fortress's readiness. The launch was standard. A nighttime takeoff from Kadena, a rendezvous with a tanker over the lonely expanse of the North Pacific, drinking in thousands of pounds of JP-7. Then, the acceleration. Climbing through 40,000 feet, the world outside the cockpit darkened. Passing through Mach 2.0, the aircraft began its thermal growth, the airframe expanding, sealing its own fuel tanks. At Mach 3.0 and 80,000 feet, Major H stabilized the Blackbird. The ride was smooth, the familiar hum a comforting constant. The mission clock ticked down. They were in the groove. Then, the first anomaly, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the engine harmonics. A slight yaw instantly corrected by the automatic flight control system. Major H's eyes scanned the engine instruments. Everything was in the green. Perhaps a momentary inlet spike disturbance, a patch of slightly uneven air. He continued. Minutes later it happened, a violent percussive bang that shuddered through the titanium structure. The aircraft jerked sharply to the right. Warning lights illuminated across the forward instrument panel. The right engine exhaust gas temperature, EGT. Needle spiked deep to the red, then began a wild, erratic swing. The cockpit voice recorder would later capture the calm, clipped exchange, belying the adrenaline flooding their systems. Right engine EGT's pegged. I see it. Throttling back. Major H retarded the right throttle. The response was wrong. Instead of the engine calming, the yaw to the right intensified. The left engine, still at cruise power, was now pulling the aircraft in a vicious, uncontrollable arc. The flight controls grew heavy. The SR-71 was designed for stability at speed, but this was an asymmetric thrust scenario of the worst kind, at the edge of the performance envelope. The Mach meter began to unwind 3.1, 3.9. Altitude bled away. We've got a serious yaw. Trying to compensate. Left engine is losing power. Inlet unstabilized. The catastrophe was cascading. The violent yaw had disrupted the delicate shockwave pattern in the left engine inlet, causing an unstart. A hammer blow of reverse thrust slammed from the left side, compounding the yaw from the failed right engine. The aircraft was now in a subsonic, descending flat spin, a condition it was never designed to survive. At 70,000 feet, the sky was no longer a serene black, but a whirling vortex of blue and darkness. The G-forces began to build, pressing the crew into their seats, then sideways against their harnesses. Major H fought the controls, but the laws of physics had won. The aircraft was departing controlled flight. The spin was tightening. The altimeter unwound with alarming speed. Through the chaos, training took over. The emergency checklist for catastrophic failure at high altitude had one ultimate instruction. Les, we're going to have to punch out. Roger. Ejecting on your mark. There was no more time for procedure. At approximately 35,000 feet, with the aircraft in a near vertical, spinning dive, Major H reached for the ejection ring between his knees. He pulled. For Captain Leslie C. in the rear seat, the sequence was automatic. The canopy explosively jettisoned, the cartridge under his seat fired, and a rocket motor propelled him up and out into the screaming slipstream. For Major H, the sequence was flawed. The violent spin and G-forces had damaged the sequencing mechanism. His canopy blew, but his ejection seat failed to fire immediately. For one heart-stopping second, he was still in the tumbling cockpit, the wind tearing at his pressure suit. Then, a secondary cartridge ignited, blasting him clear on a skewed, violent trajectory. Two ejection seats, trailing stabilizer drogues, arsed through the sky. Below them, the mortally wounded Blackbird, now a mass of compromised titanium, continued its death spiral. The right engine, completely detached from its mounts, tore away from the airframe. The aircraft broke apart, scattering debris across a miles-long corridor of the empty Bering Sea and the remote, frozen coastline of the Chukotka Peninsula. For the Soviet radar operators watching their scopes, the supreme constant blip that was the SR-71 suddenly fragmented into a dozen smaller, descending returns. The ghost had not just been caught, it had been torn apart. In the thin, freezing air at 30,000 feet, time distorts. For Major H and Captain Leslie, the violence of ejection gave way to a profound, deafening silence. The roar of the disintegrating aircraft faded below them. The only sound was the rush of wind against their pressure suit helmets. They were in free fall, the earth, of white and brown patchwork of frozen tundra, coastline, and dark water silently rotating below. Automatic systems took over. At a preset altitude, barometric sensors triggered the deployment of their parachutes. With a jarring, reassuring snap, the canopies blossomed, arresting their plunge and exchanging the roar of wind for a new, eerie quiet. The sensory shock was total. Minutes before, they had been in a climate-controlled cockpit at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Now they dangled in 50-degree F air, the cold immediately seeking any weakness in their suits. They were trained to assess. Major H, swinging in his harness, scanned the horizon. He saw the smoking impact plume of his aircraft on a frozen coastal plain perhaps 10 miles inland. He saw the vast gray expanse of the Bering Sea to the east. And he saw, with a sinking clarity, that the prevailing winds were carrying him away from the water, deeper into Soviet territory. The sea meant a chance of pickup by submarine or disguised vessel. The land meant capture or a battle against the wilderness. On the ground, the Soviet machine was already in motion. The radar sites had tracked the breakup. A high-priority alert shot up the chain of command. An American reconnaissance aircraft was down on Soviet soil. For the PVO Strany and the KGB, this was the moment they had trained for but never truly expected. This was not a defector seeking asylum. This was a catastrophic intrusion. The wreckage of the most secret American aircraft was scattered across their territory, and at least one, possibly two, crewmen were descending by parachute. At nearby Anadyr Ugolnij Air Base and other PVO installations, the klaxons sounded. MiG-17 and MiG-19 fighters, more suited to low-altitude visual search, were scrambled first. Their orders: locate the parachutes, find the wreckage, and establish a perimeter. Mi-8 HIP helicopters, carrying armed troops from KGB border guard units, were fueled and loaded. On the ground, every local militia officer, every military patrol, every remote outpost was notified. A dragnet was closing over square miles of some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, but it was a dragnet operated by the most persistent and well-resourced police in history. Major H landed hard in a shallow valley, the crust of snow giving way beneath him. His training was immediate and absolute. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The SEER protocol activated. The first step was to disappear. He gathered his parachute, bundling the conspicuous white nylon as best he could. He needed to put distance between his landing point and any search party. He scanned his survival kit, a 38 caliber survival pistol, flares, a small medical pack, fishing gear, water purification tablets, and high-calorie food bars. It was meant for a few days in a remote but generally hospitable environment, not an Arctic winter in enemy territory. He moved using the sparse cover of rock outcroppings and the lay of the land. His pressure suit, while insulating, was bright orange and bulky, a beacon against the snow. He had to find better cover before the helicopters arrived. The sound of their rotors was already a distant thrum on the frigid air. He was not just a pilot anymore. He was an evasion asset. His value to the United States was now twofold: the intelligence in his mind about routes and procedures, and the propaganda victory he would represent if displayed in a Moscow courtroom. He could not allow either to be captured. Meanwhile, Captain Leslie had landed closer to the coast. His situational awareness presented a different calculus. The sea ice was visible. If he could reach it, and if Apollonia, a stretch of open water, existed, there was a sliver of a chance. He activated his survival radio, sending a short, encrypted burst signal on the guarded frequency. It was a tremendous risk. The Soviets would be monitoring all emergency bands. But it was a risk he had to take. The signal was a digital scream into the void. I am alive. I am here. In the Bering Sea, just outside the 12-mile territorial limit, a U.S. Navy vessel, part of a routine electronic intelligence collection mission, intercepted the faint, coded distress signal. The message was relayed via satellite in a flash. At the Pentagon, at Strategic Air Command, and in a secure vault at Kadena, the quiet panic of a broken arrow scenario, the loss of a nuclear weapon or a sensitive asset took hold. But this was worse. This was Dark Night, a code for the loss of an SR-71 and its crew in denied territory. The most secret recovery machinery of the Cold War, a joint operation between Air Force Special Operations and the CIA's Special Activities Division, began to spin up. A race against time, geography, and the entire Soviet security apparatus had begun, and the starting pistol had been the soft thud of a parachute landing on Siberian snow. On the frozen ground, Major H's world shrank to the next ridge, the next patch of concealment. The first priority was to shed the high-visibility orange pressure suit. In a shallow depression, shielded by rocks, he wrestled out of the bulky garment, revealing the standard olive-drab flight suit beneath. He buried the pressure suit and his parachute under rocks and snow, a crude but necessary act of camouflage. Now, he was marginally less visible, but also far more vulnerable to the cold. He kept his survival vest and kit. The sound of aircraft became constant. The low, slow-flying MiG-17s crisscrossed the sky, their pilots scanning the white expanse. Then came the deeper thrum of Mi-8 helicopters, orbiting likely areas, disgorging teams of soldiers who fanned out in organized search lines. From his hiding place, Major H could see them, dark figures against the snow, moving with the grim efficiency of a military sweep. He was a rabbit in a field with slowly closing beaters. His training dictated evasion. Move at night, stay in low ground, avoid leaving tracks, conserve energy. But the Arctic day in that season was long, and the terrain offered little sustenance or shelter. The cold was a tangible enemy, sapping his strength with every hour. He activated his own survival radio only at pre-briefed, fleeting windows, sending encrypted burst signals identical to his RSO's. Each transmission was a gamble, potentially giving the Soviet direction-finding teams a fix. But it was the only thread connecting him to the possibility of rescue. Between transmissions, he was utterly alone, with nothing but his thoughts, the crushing silence of the tundra, and the ever-present fear of a bootstep on the snow behind him. While the Major evaded, the U.S. recovery machinery, known informally as the Special Operations Liaison Line or SOL, launched into its clandestine protocol. It was not a dramatic cavalry charge. It was a shadow war of logistics, signals, and deniable assets. The first step was confirmation and precise location. Overhead, in international airspace, RC-135 rivet joint electronic intelligence aircraft and U-2Rs from Detachment G in Alaska strained their sensors, listening for the crew's beacon signals and, more critically, monitoring Soviet communications. They mapped the search patterns, identified the command frequencies of the Soviet ground forces, and pinpointed to the location of the wreckage. This intelligence was fused in real time at the National Military Command Center. The political calculus was excruciating. A direct military incursion by helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft to snatch the crew would be an act of war, likely to fail and escalate. The only viable option was a non-attributable, clandestine extraction, likely via a maritime pickup if the crew could reach the coast. This meant the crew had to evade on their own for potentially days, moving towards a prearranged, unguarded point on the rugged coastline. The CIA's maritime branch, using assets designed for infiltrating agents, prepared a vessel. It would not be a warship, but a civilian-appearing fishing trawler or a merchant ship with a modified hull, capable of launching a small, quiet boat in the dark. This pickup ship would loiter just outside the territorial limit, a needle in the haystack of legitimate marine traffic, its crew of specialists waiting for a signal that might never come. On the Alaskan side, Air Force A-1 Skyraider pilots, veterans of the long-distance rescue missions in Vietnam, were put on alert. Their propeller-driven aircraft had the long loiter time to provide cover, but could not enter Soviet airspace. The plan was a fragile house of cards, dependent on two exhausted, freezing men evading one of the world's most formidable manhunts and reaching an exact spot on a hostile shore. Meanwhile, the Soviets reached the primary crash site. What they found was a field of shattered titanium, not a coherent aircraft. The secrets of the SR-71 were not in a single readable black box, but in the totality of its design. The engine inlet geometry, the radar-absorbing paint, the sensor apertures. TGB officers, assisted by aerospace engineers flown in from Moscow, swarmed the debris. They cordoned off miles of territory. Every fragment, no matter how small, was collected, cataloged, and crated for transport to secret research institutes. The intelligence prize was unprecedented, but it was incomplete. They had the body of the ghost, but where was its soul? Where were the men who flew it? For Captain Leslie, the coast was both hope and peril. Evading the immediate search parties, he found a precarious hiding place among the jagged, wind-scoured rocks near the shoreline. The sea ice was patchy, with leads of dark, freezing water visible. He knew the pickup protocol, a specific stretch of coastline, a precise time after local sunset, a series of light signals. But reaching that exact location meant moving across open ground with Soviet patrols intensifying. His burst signals had confirmed his general area to the listening RC-135s, but they also heightened the Soviet electronic search. He was running out of time, energy, and options. Major H, deeper inland, faced a more complex evasion. He witnessed the Soviet recovery operation firsthand from a distant ridge, the trucks, the helicopters ferrying debris, the establishment of a semi-permanent camp at the crash site. His path to the coast was now blocked by this cordon. The decision was brutal. circle widely, consuming days of scant resources, or attempt a risky, direct move under the cover of the next Arctic night. He chose movement. Using the rocky, broken terrain of river valleys, he traveled at night, guided by the stars, melting snow for water in his mouth, forcing down the high-calorie food to keep his core temperature up. The cold was a constant, grinding ache. He avoided all signs of human presence, once freeze for an hour in a crevice as a Soviet patrol passed within 50 meters, their flashlights sweeping the rocks. The U.S. command, monitoring Soviet comms via the rivet joint aircraft, understood the net was tightening. The Soviet search was becoming more focused, shifting from a wide-area sweep to targeted probes based on possible sighting reports and signal intercepts. The decision was made to activate the Maritime Extraction Plan Captain Leslie deemed to have the higher probability of success. On a night shrouded in fog, the covert pickup vessel, running dark, deployed a small black rubber boat with a silenced outboard. Two Special Activities Division operatives, armed and equipped for a combat swimmer extraction, navigated by night vision goggles through the icy leads, following a homing beacon activated by Leslie's final, desperate burst signal. The operation was a masterpiece of timing and stealth. Locating Leslie among the rocks, they signaled with an infrared blink. Within 90 seconds, he was in the boat, wrapped in a thermal blanket. The boat retreated to the mothership, which melted into the fog and the international shipping lanes before first light. For Captain Leslie, the ordeal was over. For the Soviet forces combing the coastline the next morning, there was only frustration. A man had vanished from under their noses. Major H's fate diverged. After 3 days of evasion, cold, exhaustion, and dwindling supplies took their ultimate toll. While attempting to cross a frozen river, he was spotted by a roving patrol of KGB border guards. Too weak to run, with no cover, he was captured without a shot fired. The propaganda victory the Kremlin craved was, at least partially, theirs. He was transported from the local garrison to Lefortovo prison in Moscow, the dreaded processing center for high-value political prisoners. The intelligence reckoning now entered a delicate shadow phase. The Soviets had the wreckage and one of the 2 crewmen. The United States had salvaged 1 crewman, and through its signals intelligence, a comprehensive map of the Soviet recovery response. In Moscow, Major H was subjected to intense interrogation. But he was a trained SEER graduate. He provided only name, rank, service number, and date of birth, as per the Code of Conduct. The technological secrets of the SR-71 were not in his head in a form that could be easily extracted. They were in the blueprints at Lockheed and the experience of the Skunk Works engineers. His real value was operational. Knowledge of routes, frequencies, and protocols. He gave them nothing. The political negotiation was conducted through the icy, formal channels of Cold War diplomacy. Loud public demands for the pilot's return would acknowledge the illegal overflight and the crashed spy plane, a propaganda loss for Washington. Instead, back-channel communications, likely via intelligence liaisons, worked for a quiet exchange. After several months of imprisonment, Major H was released at the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, exchanged for a captured Soviet intelligence officer held by the West. The swap was unpublicized, another secret transaction in the hidden economy of the conflict. The material intelligence from the wreckage, however, was a tangible Soviet gain. While the airframe was destroyed, the analysis of its titanium alloy composition, its radar-absorbent paint, and the remnants of its engine and inlet geometry provided invaluable insights. This knowledge directly influenced the next generation of Soviet aerospace engineering, seen in the design of the MiG-31 Foxhound's Zaslin radar and the shaping of subsequent prototype interceptors. It was a partial payback for the years of helpless tracking. For the U.S., the loss forced a grim audit. While the SR-71's fundamental invulnerability in flight remained intact, the program's protocols were tightened. Egress routes were re-evaluated to maximize proximity to international waters, and survival equipment for Arctic conditions was enhanced. The incident proved that while the machine was nearly perfect, The human and political elements of the mission were forever fraught with mortal risk. The story of the lost Blackbird over Siberia is a parable of the Cold War, etched not in the broad strokes of tank divisions or missile treaties, but in the silent, high-altitude lines of a reconnaissance track. It encapsulates the entire conflict. The breathtaking technological ambition, the relentless mirror-image opposition, the unforgiving geography that served as both battleground and buffer, and the stark human vulnerability at the center of it all. The SR-71 represented the zenith of a certain kind of confidence, a belief that machines could be built to master physics and thus, by extension, geopolitics. It was a tool of pure intelligence, designed to render the opaque transparent, to reduce the paranoid secrecy of a closed society to a series of developable photographs. Its near invulnerability was a form of power, a daily demonstration of technological supremacy that gnawed at the Soviet military psyche. Yet, the incident over Chukotka served as a cold reminder of the limits of that confidence. Engineering could be pushed to the very edge, but never beyond it. The machine, for all its majesty, was mortal. For the Soviet interceptor pilots and the PPVO Strany was a fleeting, Pyrrhic validation. They did not shoot down the Habu, they watched it fall. Their victory was one of patience and of the immutable laws of mechanical failure. It proved that their vigilance was not in vain, that the fortress walls, though regularly scaled, could still claim a trespasser. The intelligence gleaned from the wreckage was a consolation prize after years of frustration, a fragment of the ghost to be studied and reverse-engineered, feeding the endless cycle of measure and countermeasure. Ultimately, the most enduring legacy of this event is human. It is a story of extreme professionalism, of pilots trained to operate at the very limits of human endurance, and then trained again to survive when that technology vanished. It is a story of a clandestine support network that functioned in the shadows, a testament to the unsung machinery of intelligence and special operations that worked to mitigate disaster. And it is a story of solitary endurance, of a man alone in a frozen expanse, embodying the final irreducible asset of any nation, the will to survive and return. The SR-71 itself has long since been retired, its mission taken over by satellites and stealth drones. The Soviet Union is gone. The interceptors that scrambled are museum pieces. But the contours of the drama remain relevant. The hunger for intelligence, the fragility of even the most advanced systems, and the quiet, desperate courage required when the plans fall apart and a person is left with nothing but their training and their will, dangling in the silent sky above enemy territory. It was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a single, stark moment where the abstract, strategic chess game of the Cold War became, for two men, terrifyingly and personally real. A moment when a ghost became a man, and the vast, impersonal conflict narrowed to the sound of one's own breathing, the crunch of snow underfoot, and the distant thrum of hunters in the sky.